Absolutely. I would say it's one of the most important things to get right and to get right now. I think we need to insist on good policy frameworks. Now, I can draw on the example of having spent the last 4 years working closely with the Ghanaian government on how they were developing policy for industrialization. So looking at how to redraft policy for the automotive, pharmaceutical, and textile and garment sectors. The automotive industry in Ghana in the 60s was one of the biggest hubs for automotive. It was state owned and thriving. However, over the years, that decreased. I think essentially it dwindled, and opportunities arose in South Africa and Morocco, which today in Africa are the two biggest hubs for the automotive industry. So our policy work was really designed around understanding what potential auto manufacturers would be looking for if they were looking to move into the market, what they liked in other jurisdictions that perhaps they were not seeing in Ghana, and also, what are some of the incentives that they would like to see. And I think over a period of 6 months, we surveyed about 500 companies. And as a result of that, we were then able to utilize a lot of that information to that into a new policy. In a matter of 3 months, the policy was passed through cabinet. And then after that, we saw the first mover in the market was Volkswagen. And after Volkswagen, 14 others have now followed. So it's an excellent example of how, when you draft sound policy and incentive framework, investors will come. Ghana in 4 years has moved from zero OEMs, so that's the auto manufacturers, to today 15. And largely many of the names that you'd have heard of, such as Peugeot, Nissan, Toyota, Kia, etc. So again, I think it's very easy for people to talk about attracting investment. Really, we can all do that. And we can entice investors in, but how do you keep them? That's the vital question. And the thing that makes them the longevity of an investor is to make sure that there's a sound governance framework, sound policy, and also sound incentives. And so with that, when you look at, excuse me, when you look at the critical mineral space, it's really important that we look at how this policy will help shape industries, which is why I go back to what I earlier alluded to, which is we need to understand how these minerals are going to be used for industrialization, because really that's what Africa needs. And by the way, Africa's approach to critical minerals shouldn't be seen as a one size fits all, like we see minerals being used in the US markets, used in the Chinese markets, etc. It's actually very different for us on the continent. Why? A few things. One is that we have a lack of energy. So our base load is still fledgling. And I think when thinking about moving up the value chain, thinking about beneficiation and value addition, we need to ensure that we have our rock bed of, enough base load to deal with manufacturing and processing. So the way that we develop critical minerals will need that foundation corrected, if you like. So that's number one. Number two is that we need infrastructure. If you're going to move minerals from mines out to ports, then you're going to need infrastructure that includes roads and ports. So all of that development needs to be in place prior to you thinking about how you're utilizing these minerals. And lastly, it's water. You cannot have the breaking of rocks, for example, that very physical approach without using water. Water is vital. And so thinking about value addition, thinking about beneficiation of critical minerals, if you have that within your nation, but you have a real lack of water, then that's a problem. So it needs to have that kind of rock bed or that foundation before we start thinking about how we're developing these minerals. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, when we've talked about policy, we need to think about where the market lies. So currently we look at, electric vehicles and the electric vehicle supply chain as being something that, Africa should be ensuring that it has a place within the supply chain. And we know China has a lot of the supply chain for EV sewn up. It has the biggest market for electric vehicles, followed by the US market. And also, they dominate when it comes to mineral processing, as I'm sure Roshan will be able to confirm. And I think if that's the case, then we need to start thinking about, well, what are the meaningful areas that Africa can get involved in within that EV supply chain? Is it that we need to look at maybe setting up sovereign wealth funds so that when the extraction of the minerals is happening, we're also putting money aside to then invest back into key areas such as infrastructure and technical skills and capacity. There's also things like looking at how we can perhaps work with some of the downstream buyers. But I think with the EV supply chain, it is very difficult to sort of look at that in the short term. It'll have to be sort of long-term approach to how Africa can really get involved in the supply chain for EVs. And I think where I see the gap is the fact that Africa's population will be in 30 years 2.6 billion. We will have a very growing youth population on the continent, and the technical skills that are required for electric vehicle manufacturing, etc., could be sourced from Africa if we start to make sure that we've got that capacity building happening now, and technical skills, etc. So for me, I think that is a clear area that Africa can definitely get involved in. Of course, when you think about processing and manufacturing, it's with a 15 to 20-year view. So I think that's the kind of role that we need to play now in terms of the policies that we develop to ensure that by 15 to 20 years, we are in the place where we can start to input meaningfully into the supply chain. Thank you.